Welcome everyone to the webinar on Decolonizing Governance from Community-Led Perspectives. This webinar is organized by Dr. Ranjan Datta and the Earth System Governance Project, also called the ESG Project. It is our great pleasure to host this online event as part of the South-South initiative, which has been launched in March by the ESG Project. And I'd like to give the floor to Jane Butler, Executive Director of the International Project Office of the ESG Project, so that she can introduce the project as well as the South-South initiative. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camille. Welcome everybody. I'm Jane Butler, the Executive Director of the International Project Office, and I'm just going to really briefly introduce the webinar today, but also the ESG project for those of you who are not familiar. So I had the pleasure to meet Ranjan actually last year at the Earth System Governance Toronto conference. We were walking to the closing plenary session on the last day, and Ranjan had just presented his research. So because I didn't get to see that session, unfortunately, I'm really happy that he can be here today to share online to a wider audience as well in coordination with the project. So for those of you who don't know us, we're primarily a research network. So we bring researchers together on the theme of governance and global environmental change. What do we do? We really aim to explore political solutions and the kind of novel and more effective governance systems to cope with global environmental change of the 21st century. We do this through various ways, but generally, we just really want to expand the global mobilization of researchers in this field. We really believe in the inter and transdisciplinary potential to solve sustainability problems. So our office and the Earth System Governance Project wants to stimulate that kind of research collaboration and keep a really vibrant community going. And thirdly, we really want to enable researchers to inform and advise at the science policy interface. The project's been around since 2008. And through various ways, we've been really involved in multilateral governance solutions. So the South-South initiative is part of what we're doing today. It's a webinar series, and it was started 1 year ago by several scientific steering committee members who were from or based in the Global South, with the aim essentially of increasing research exchanges and addressing regionally relevant topics that had been under-addressed before, but we really just want to strengthen the network on a global level. So our aims, what we're doing today is the virtual workshop, which scholars from or based in the so-called Global South. Our next webinars will be based on human right to water, as well as climate governance in Latin America. So it's quite diverse, but again, with the aim of increasing dialogue from a South-South level, as well as a South-North level. So we're really excited this year. We have an annual conference, but this is the first year that we will have one full day dedicated to South-South dialogues based on the initiative, and that will be in the Netherlands. And finally, I'd like to just say that we do have a journal, the Earth System Governance Journal. The last part of the initiative this year will be an open call for the South-South special issue. So we're really excited that actually we've attained a Q1 journal status this year. So any researchers involved who would love to contribute to this special issue, it will be a great opportunity, and we'll announce more in October. So I'll give it back to Camille to introduce Ranjan.
Thank you so much, Jane, for this introduction. And yes, of course, our speaker today is Dr. Ranjan Datta. He's Assistant Professor, Canada Research Chair in Community Disaster Research at Indigenous Studies, Department of Humanities, Mount Royal University in Canada. His research interests include advocating for Indigenous environmental sustainability, as well as responsibilities for decolonial research, Indigenous water and energy justice, critical anti-racist climate change resilience, cross-cultural community research. He has a total of almost 60 peer-reviewed publications on decolonial research, traditional story sharing, Indigenous community-based participatory action research, Indigenous land water, and sustainability issues. Dr. Datta has actually a strong understanding on decolonial research based on 17 years of conducting research with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada, in the US, as well as South Asia. His current research program is supported by his existing network of Indigenous, visible minority, immigrants and refugees, Black communities, scholars, students, practitioners, and professionals in Canada and beyond. So before handing over to our speaker, I would just like to remind you that today's event will consist of 3 sessions. The first session will be the presentation of Dr. Ranjan Datta. He will be presenting the findings of his interdisciplinary research that he conducted in collaboration with 4 co-researchers in Bangladesh in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. This research actually aims to explore how Indigenous communities in the region perceive sustainability in relation to their own traditional knowledge of land and resource management. Additionally, the presentation will examine the construction of governmental and transnational policies within the socially and ecologically contested landscapes of the region. And following this presentation, and before concluding the event, there will be an interactive discussion between our speaker and the attendees for about 30 minutes. So please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand virtually to ask questions to Dr. Datta. So thank you everyone again for joining us today. And I now hand over to Dr. Ranjan Datta for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear my voice?
Yeah, and your presentation is good.
Thank you. Thanks again for this opportunity to sharing my research. Decolonization. I would like to start with decolonization is a lifelong learning process. It has 3 steps: learning, then unlearning what is not working for the community. And the third responsibility is relearning what is or should do with the Indigenous community the way community wants. Today, I'm going to share my previous research that I have been doing for my regular research. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk about what does the decolonization mean in environmental governmental research, and what kind of challenges the community have been facing, and how to overcome those challenges from my case study that I have learned. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge all Indigenous people, all Indigenous nation, all land-based communities, those who have been fighting in their everyday life to protect their land, water, their identity, their language. My gratitude to them, and also my gratitude the creating the opportunity to learning. I also would like to acknowledge the colonial history in all over the world, particularly currently the land I am living, TD7 territory in Canada, and also the land I came from in Bangladesh, that how it has been colonized and also ongoing colonization is happening. I also would like to acknowledge that traditional stories as a scientific stories, land-based stories as a scientific stories. An Indigenous elder, knowledge keeper are the scientists because they know what is good for the community. They have been living in the community and they are giving, they have been using lots of land-based knowledge to empower the community. That's why in my research, Indigenous elders, knowledge keeper, I consider as a scientist. And also I would like to acknowledge all of you to acknowledge your land, your Indigenous people, minority people, those who have been suffering for their land rights, their identity rights, and language right. So before I start my presentation, I would like to situate who I am. I have cross-cultural socialization, and also interdisciplinary education. It means I born and raised in minority communities. When I'm saying minority, it include non mainstream people. That means those who are not mainstream in religious perspective, Indigenous people, and also other minorities. Those who have been facing extreme displacement and other discrimination in their land, in their other cultural perspective, and also land-based learning. I had the opportunity to learn many Indigenous communities from South Asia, particularly from Bangladesh. I'm also currently working with Indigenous community in Canada, Cree, Dene, Inuit, and Métis. And my mother tongue is Bangla. As you can see, I speak English, but English is my not primary language. Currently, I'm learning Cree indigenous language. Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper helping me to learn. Indigenous language is the significant part to understand the meanings of land, meanings of people. That's why as a color settler, I'm trying to learn indigenous language here. So before I start my case studies, I would like to give overall my understanding. How do I understand the meanings of environmental governance from my 17 years of experience? So what is the decolonial meaning of research in environmental governance? Decolonization in environmental governance doesn't happen without talking about indigenous right, indigenous land rights. When I'm talking about indigenous land right, it's not the colonial forms of ownership to the land. It's our obligation to the land, our responsibility to the lands. Without understanding indigenous land rights, decolonization doesn't happen. And as you know, the indigenous people or minority people, land-based people, those who have been keeping their land for millions of years sustainable, and their knowledge is scientific knowledge. That's why indigenous ways of understanding land is significant aspect of understanding environmental governance. The second important aspect I have learned from South Asia, Africa, even from here, we need to decolonize the way we understand and the way we do from the community perspective. Without decolonizing our ways of knowing and doing, the decolonization and meaningful environmental governance doesn't happen. Another important aspect I have learned from the community from my 17 years of learning experience, we need to learn, respect, and honor indigenous ways of knowing and doing, because it's already proven that indigenous people, they keep their environment sustainable for millions of years. So that's why we as a researcher, we as a professional, we as a policymaker, we have to understand, learn, respect, and honor indigenous ways of knowing and doing. Another aspect I have learned from last 13 years from Canada, Truth and Reconciliation Commission call for action. In 94 call for action in Canada, particularly people, those who are from outside of Canada, I would like to request you to search Truth and Reconciliation call for action and see 94 call for action, how it's interconnected with our work and with our learning and thinking. Indigenous people that I have learned from my 17 years of experience, they never deny Western perspective. What is happening now? The indigenous people, they are being used Western ways of knowing. Indigenous people, they want to use Western perspective to solve their problem. But now the indigenous people, they are being used for the Western colonial perspective. That's why many indigenous community, they want to make meaningful bridge between Western perspective, academics, and communities. Last not least important, when we are talking about environmental governance, we have to understand, we have to reclaim indigenous land, water, culture, and language. They are all interconnected. We cannot separate from each other. As you have seen, there are many ways of understanding meaningful environmental governance, but these are the few perspectives that I had opportunity to learn many times in South Asia, in Africa, currently in Canada. So indigenous community, they talk about why they are facing many kinds of challenges when they are talking about environmental governance. First challenge is this. They explain there are many miscommunication between indigenous people, land-based minority people, and scientists and policymaker. Miscommunication regarding the development, miscommunication meanings of research. The risk is not that indigenous people, they do not use the research. They have been using research for many, many years, many thousands years, but their meanings was very different. That's why indigenous scholar Linda Smith, she said, current forms of research become mosquito, suck your blood, then leave. The indigenous community that I was working in Bangladesh, they said the research became a foreign bird. They come to take your knowledge, they never show up. And miscommunication also the meanings of development. When we are talking about the development, we are talking the colonial forms of development is exclude indigenous people, exclude non-human, is only profit maximization for the outsider and also for the only human, only outsider mainstream human. That's why when we are talking about environmental governance, we have to understand the current forms of miscommunication, how it created by the through colonization. And many researchers, according to the community, they said the many researchers, policymakers, even government industries, they fail to decolonize. They are unwilling to learn the community perspective and refuse indigenous self-governance. The indigenous self-governance has been sustainable for 1,000 years, but many industries, government, policymaker, researcher, they refuse self-governance in their research, in their policies. And lack of collaborative approaches that the many indigenous community, they see significant challenge because many researchers in North America, in South Asia, they think if they talk with a one person, they are done. So as you know, knowledge varies land to land, community to community, generation to generation. And this diversity are the beauty of the indigenous ways of knowing and doing. That's why the indigenous community lack of collaborative approach is one of the significant challenge in environmental governance. Settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is not past, it's ongoing. It became new forms of extreme colonization, particularly in South Asia, Bangladesh, with indigenous communities by the mainstream people. And also racism. Racism is not only color, it's about the power, how indigenous people land has been taken on, how indigenous people has been tortured, displaced, and losing their mother tongue, indigenous ways of knowing. So racism in our everyday practice is alive, is not past. So I have been doing this research using participatory action research by using various forms of qualitative perspective. So in my research, I have been using traditional storytelling as a scientific method. As when I'm talking about indigenous storytelling, mostly storytelling from indigenous elder, medicine person, and also knowledge keeper, because they tell the story that has been successful in their life. I've been using music, art, and dance as the scientific method when they are talking about their water rights, when they are talking about the cultivation system. I have learned the one method from North America that I also used in Bangladesh. It's called blanket exercise. Blanket exercise is indigenous method that indigenous elder, knowledge keeper, and you talk about how their land has been colonized and still colonization is going on. And also I used land-based working with indigenous elder and knowledge keeper to explaining the meanings of land, meanings of governance. In my research, I don't call my research as a participant. I don't call the community people as a participant, because according to indigenous elder, when we are saying participant, I as a researcher has power. When I am talking about participant, I as a researcher have power to use them according to my need. That's why many indigenous communities in Bangladesh and here, they call me relative. Once we are using concept of relative or relationship, I become responsible to my relationship. So my research, that's why, is using the relational theoretical framework. And my research is the part of everyday movement to changing who I am, movement to protect the land and water, not for the other people, for me, for my future generation. I also use reflective learning. it means when I'm going, when I'm learning, when I'm working with the indigenous elder and knowledge keeper, I try to reflect what I have learned, how my learning is reshaping me, who I am and who I need to be. I use another method, it's called deep listening. When I'm listening, I do not interrupt the indigenous elder and knowledge keeper, because they are talking, not only focusing what I want, they talk in a holistic perspective. That's why it's significant to understand the importance of the deep listening. So I would like to give one example from my previous research. I've been working with indigenous community in Bangladesh. So indigenous community that I was working, it was one of the smallest indigenous community is in Chittagong Hill Tracts, is the hilly part of the Bangladesh. For doing research, I used a relational theoretical framework from 4 perspectives. I use relationship to from the indigenous scholar, because when I use relationship, I become responsible for my thinking, for my action, for my doing. The second second perspective, I use the hybridity. I use this concept, the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha. In hybridity, the meanings of land is, to the indigenous people, is God. The meanings of land is their family member. The meanings of land is their friend. And when we are using concept of hybridity, their God lives with them. They can touch them, they can feel them. So they become relative and they become relational. As a researcher, I also become relational. When I become relational, it means I become responsible to my research. The second method I use from another post-colonial theorist, Edward Said, otherness. When I'm using otherness, otherness is a colonial ways of understanding. So relationship help me to understand or break down the boundaries between me and the community people. So once I become relational, it's make us relative. So we are not considering the concept of land, concept of people as others. That's why in my research, the community people, they are the co-researcher. They are the one who is helping me to learn. So I become learner and they become the teacher. They become the scientist. That concept I use traditional ways of knowing as a scientific method. I use a anthropologist Levi-Strauss, because Levi-Strauss said if any method or any medicine had been sustainable for a long time, why don't you call the science? That's why we need to rethink what is the meaning of science. We need to rethink what is the meaningful environmental governance through traditional knowledge. The last concept I used to understand the indigenous knowledge as effective and meaningful ways of creating climate change, creating meaningful ways of environmental governance. So when I went to the Bangladesh, one of the small communities called Khiang indigenous community, those who have been living the hilly areas, the many outsiders, they are coming to the land. And when I'm saying outsider, it's only man is coming to the indigenous land and taking indigenous land for their own purpose. They're creating the brick field within the forest, whereas the big field is prohibited to build within the forest. But government has given the permission to build the big field within the indigenous community for the outsider. So they are taking all the reserve forest wood and burning the creating the brick field within the community for the outsider. As you can see, the reserve forest that has been created for the outsider, indigenous people, they had been living in their land for hundreds of years, but they don't have access in the reserve forest. But outsider, they can use those brick for the burning or creating the brick field. So indigenous elder, and one of the is called traditional governance called Karbari. He said, the current forms of governance is creating the power disparity. They're creating the ongoing colonization over the indigenous ways of understanding, ways of governing the environment. That's why the indigenous elder, they said, meaningful governance is collective story sharing, collective ways of knowing. So another indigenous elder, she said, in the environmental governance is traditional cloth making, to learn our ways of making clothes so that we are not polluting our land and our water by the current forms of garments factories. And another indigenous elder said, meaningful environmental governance is collective ways of doing. When we were doing research, we had a 4 co-researcher from the community suggested by the elder and knowledge keeper. They became our part of the researcher team, and their first time in their history, they wrote 4 books in their own language, the meanings of environmental governance. And it's not maybe the big step, but it has created the meaningful collaboration with the community. And the 4 co-researchers, they became very excited about their work, and they're still continuing their working. So it's not showing. Okay, another example I would like to show from my current research, how pipeline leak or the energy, current forms of energy management is creating, destroying the traditional forms of environmental governance. According to CBC, Canadian Broadcast Corporation News Media, it says within 2000 to 2018, there was 18.9 billion oil leak happened in Saskatchewan, currently the land we have been living last 10 years. So I was trying to understand how big 18.9 billion means. It is, if we calculate 2.6 million liter, equivalent to roughly 1 Olympic size of swimming pool, it is equivalent to 7,307 roughly Olympic size of swimming pool. And most of the oil leak happens within the indigenous communities. And similar picture I have seen when the many industries is doing the various forms of industry in indigenous community in Bangladesh. So it's not, I think I have to reload my presentation. Can I do that?
Of course, Ranjan.
Anyway, I think it's not showing in my in Microsoft team. Anyway, so that's why indigenous elder, when we are talking about the pipeline leak impact, how is we are understanding the indigenous elder, they said we need to decolonize the way we understand the meanings of impact, because when pipeline leak happened to the indigenous land and water, they see only impact on the water, only impact on the water only. But indigenous community, they see it, impact is not only water, it's many areas, and it's impacting the 7th generation of indigenous people. How it is the 7th generation? Because it's destroy first 3 generation sustainability that the community have been working, and it's going to impact the next 3 generation because of the current generation profit maximization. That's why when we understand the meanings of impact, we need to understand, we need to decolonize the meanings of impact. So the community have been facing the many industries, government, they denied that no, there was no pipeline leak happens in the indigenous communities or anything happened. So they indigenous community, they mostly learn from the news media and many false claim. And when the the cleaning happened. There was no consultation, no community involvement, and many researchers, they came for doing research, mostly from industries. They took their sample, the mostly less effective area. And one of the researcher or engineer, they said people can drink the well and nothing is going to happen. And then indigenous community, they hired their own researcher from the universities, and they significantly disagree about the comments the engineer made. And one of the elders said, is not the science is neutral? Is not the research is neutral? If you are claiming neutral, how two different scientists, two different engineers is giving us two different forms of understanding? That's why they call it Western forms, only Western-based research. So that's why indigenous community, they think the provincial government, federal government, they broken the community trust. Industry, they broken the community trust. Scientists, they also broken the trust. We as a researcher, because we have been part of the research as well, we also broken the trust. That's why community, they don't want to trust anymore. If I go to the community and want to do research, it's regardless in South Asia, Africa, and here, people become scared. People become hopeless because they have seen many research has been going on and nothing is benefiting them. So as you know, during pipeline like happens, everyone denied. They're hiding information. There are many misinformation from the government, industry, and researcher, and there is no consultation with the community at all. That's why community think 3D rights significantly broken. So that's why the indigenous community, they want us to decolonize our ways of knowing and doing. And indigenous community, they have been living in the community for many, many years. They know how to guide. That's why they want us to work with the community, get guidelines from the elders, knowledge keeper, and according to 3D responsibility. They want us to collaborate between Western knowledge and traditional knowledge in a way community can be benefited. They also want us to involve their community people, youth, and future generation so that they can do the work meaningful way and it's not destroying the environment. And one of the significant aspects they see, we need to regularly discuss with the elder, discuss with the community leader, and according to discuss with band office. So how to decolonize our ways of knowing? We need to give right information at right time, regular meeting with the communities, ongoing conversation, community funding for the community consultation, engaging youth, protecting land, water, environment, and land. And all has to be according to 3D responsibilities, or the indigenous community we are working according to their needs. So I would like to give another example from the current community that I have been working. One of the indigenous elder, they said, decolonization means the land rights. Land is not only for human, land is for everything. So here is the one example. Oh, it's not showing. Anyway, some of the picture is not showing. I don't know why. So when we are talking about decolonizing environmental research, we need to redefine both research and researcher. We need to ask ourselves who we are, where we came from, whose land we are standing on and living on. When we are talking about whose land, it's not colonial forms of land or colonial ownership. It's about the non-human, animal, plant, insect, everyone. We need to understand what does the decolonization mean personally for me. Without decolonizing myself, when we are using decolonization, it becomes tokenization. That's why indigenous scholar Sean Wilson says, if my research is not helping me to learn, helping me to reshape who I am, we are not doing enough. So we need to understand the colonial history of the land we are standing on. The colonial history of the people that working on. What does the reconciliation look like for me? As a non-indigenous settler person here, I do not want to define the meaning of reconciliation for the indigenous people, but I can redefine who I am. I can redefine my responsibility when I am explaining the meaning of reconciliation and how to relearn from the land-based education to achieve social justice in reconciliation. So redefining environmental governance from the community perspective, it means to understand land rights. Again, land rights, not colonial forms. That's why indigenous people, they call it land back movement. Land back movement to give responsibility, to take responsibility to protecting the land, to understand our obligation to the land. Indigenous ways of knowing doesn't need validation from the Western science because it's already proven that it has scientific science. And if we calculate the colonial history 300 or 400 years, the amount of damage we made is equivalent to million years. And the indigenous people, they have been keeping their land sustainable for million years. So what is science? We need to ask ourselves. And when we are talking about environment, we need to protect indigenous language and culture. We need to honor and create space for indigenous knowledge, land-based knowledge to create meaningful sustainability and also create interconnected consciousness that knowledge varies according to land, plan to plan, and generation to generation. We need to transform our research in a way it will build community capacity. And we need to also advocate for sufficient funding. As I talked previously, we need to understand the Truth and Reconciliation Call for Action and also UNDP Indigenous Declaration. So how to transforming indigenous environmental governance into action? So we need to build meaningful bridge between community and our worldviews. In a way, community can be benefited. In a way, we can learn and we can use our research in a way it can benefit the community and also create transforming for us. Understanding complexity in solution, understand the community knowledge is not on fixed knowledge. They varies according to land, community to community. That's why we need to understand diversity of the knowledge. We need to acknowledge the multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of doing. And we need to do community-based participatory action research so that community can understand who we are, what we are doing. At the same time, I can understand what community wants, how I can be tools for the community. We need to engage community in decision making from the very beginning throughout the process. And considering community practice as a capacity building, understanding community needs in our research. Last but not least, we need to rethink how my research can be action to reshape who I am, who I need to be, and how I can be beneficial for the community. Thank you.
Ranjan, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation and for sharing with us the insights from your several case studies. I guess my first question for you before opening the floor for other questions from the audience would be that how do you envision the potential impact on the policy making and conservation level in indigenous regions? And do you think that from one region to another, the outreach takes different shapes?
Thank you. How my research is going to benefit the community, how I'm making change. This question should be not for me, but question for the community that we are working. And asking, okay, how I can be benefit, how my research that I have been working, is it beneficial or do I need to change? This learning helped me in many ways. The current forms of research is not doing anything positive to the community, but negative. So in my whole life, I learned the how to be neutral, not to speak for the community needs, because I have to be neutral, objective, scientist. In a way, I'm not taking the any perspective. But if you look at the history, science never been the neutral. They always for the need base. According to, if we understand the meaning of science, it was solving the problem. If we are not talking about what community is facing, we are not doing enough. Regarding the similarity, I always look for the similarities. As you have seen, the colonial history in the South Asia, colonial history of the North America, even Africa, there are many colonial history, very similarities. But if you look at the diverse forms of environmental governance, there are lots of positive aspects we can learn from each other. But I'm very careful because knowledge varies according to land, community to community, and generation to generation. We cannot compare one community with other communities. We only listen to the community, how they want, what they want.
Thank you so much for your answer. I see we have a hand raised in the audience. Dinga, the floor is yours.
For giving me the floor.
I cannot hear. Dinga, I cannot hear.
And might be related to your actual microphone, if you're not on mute.
Yeah, I just unmuted. I don't know if that
Now
works.
I can hear.
All right. Okay, that's fine. So thank you very much, Prof. Ranjan Datta. I hope I try to pronounce it well. Sorry if I don't. Thank you for the very exciting and inspiring presentation. I am Jinga Chris Pobabila from Cameroon. I am a PhD, final year PhD student in the University of Bamenda. Currently, my research is also focused on the aspect of community-based valuation of wetland ecosystem services in Bamenda. So I find it very interesting and inspiring to hear from you. First, the fact that the community doesn't reject the Western ways of doing things, but they rather want to use it to help them advance their communities. That is something I was struggling so hard to also try to figure it out in my research. And I am very happy that I had a very simple answer to that today, that the community doesn't reject, but the problem is that Western knowledge has been using the community for their purpose and not for their benefits, and which is what I also struggle to do here. Now, those were a few comments that I had on the presentation. Generally, I think I can maybe be in contact on email later on, but what I want to find out maybe pretty well during the presentation is how do you define local and indigenous people? If you can throw more light on that, how you do.
I think I'm missing your voice now, but I have yeah.
Can you
So I got your question that how do I define indigenous and local? This question I got. What I have learned, the meaning of indigeneity is varies according to the land, even within indigenous communities. It's regardless the South Asia here in Africa. So I, as a researcher, I asked the community how they want to identify themselves. The many indigenous community, they don't have identity rights from the according to constitution, according to the government. For example, Bangladesh, indigenous people are not recognized. They call ethnic minority. So according to, I talk with the elder, how they want to define who they are. For example, I born and raised minority community. When I'm talking about minority, it's many forms of minority. But I understand our identity is land-based identity. Those who have deep connection with the land, those who understand the land is everything for them, and land is their God, is the meaning stands from the mainstream people. The meaning stands from the mainstream ways of understanding. That's why I as a researcher, as a learner, I don't try to define anything from my perspective. Rather, as I said previously, I consider myself as a learner, as a deep learner. So when I go to the community and request community elder, knowledge keeper, and medicine person, how they want to define and how I should learn. When I'm learning, I also ask them how to use my knowledge that can purpose for the community, that can help to the community in a way they want to do it.
So I think I've taken my note, and the bottom line is to get the knowledge keeper to define what they feel can help them in terms of maybe trying to, let me put it in quotes, to segregate who really is an indigenous person in their communities. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to have been here.
Thank you.
So I see we have another question in the chat. I don't know if you managed to read it, Ranjan. I'm going to read it out loud. The question is, to what extent is the science system and so scientists ready for that change?
It's a great question that I have been facing last 17 years. I think our education system, our research system still is very colonial. And many of them are not ready to change. That's why those who we are want to learn, we have to first decolonize ourselves and build decolonial community in a way we can start making change from ourselves. And once we are making ourselves, we become relative. And once we become all relative, we are making new paradigm, new theoretical ways of understanding to challenge the scientific ways. Even the meaning of science, we need to decolonize. And we have to start from ourselves first. And I'm happy that it's growing fast. And I see that even today, many of you are here. And it means we are all wants to make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjan. Are there any further questions from the participants in this webinar? Feel free to raise your hand or send a message in the chat. It is great to have the opportunity to engage on such an important topic today.
Okay, maybe just come in and find out one other thing why the other participants are thinking on their own, maybe their own clarifications, or maybe share their experience with us. Prof. Ranjan, I would like to find out if you have faced any difficulties with the peer-reviewed communities or the gatekeepers. I am still a young scholar coming up. I can say I've not really gotten into the peer review system so well, but I just want to find out if your perspective have conflicted with maybe the knowledge gatekeepers in the big publishers or the peer review journals.
This is another colonial challenges that I face many times. When I started my research in 2005 and 6, I was trying to understand, published my work. And many journals, they rejected in a saying that, oh, this is not, it doesn't have scientific evidence. And still now, many journal, hiring journal, they are saying same thing. Even last week, we face, oh, your research is great, but it doesn't have scientific evidence. So I have been facing this problem long time, but I have seen also changes. Many decolonial researcher, and also indigenous scholar, when we are asking, requesting suggestion, they only suggest us that we need to create new platform, new peer review system. As you see in many indigenous and land-based journal, they came up. And one example is Alternative Indigenous Journal, and other many indigenous journal. So their peer review system is very different. They recognize the indigenous knowledge, elder knowledge, land-based knowledge as a scientific knowledge. So if we face any kind of problem in colonial forms of peer review, I would like to request to all of you to submit in indigenous or anti-racist and decolonial journal. Yes, still is lots of challenges is going on, but it's changing happening, but it's very slow.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the advice is very important for some of us early career researchers who are still struggling to see the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have further questions in the chat, actually, for you, Ranjan. I'm just going to read it out loud once again. Indigenous peoples have their own words, categories to explain the world, words and categories that aren't recognized by science. How are you dealing with it? For example, the term Mother Earth, field thinking, even these are simple translations.
Thank you. Indigenous knowledge, first of all, it doesn't need validation from the Western science. If we can understand this statement, that means indigenous knowledge becomes science. So we don't need to ask permission to anyone to prove it that indigenous knowledge is science or land-based knowledge is science. We have to understand land-based knowledge is already proven science. And if we think about that, yes, that is science, we don't need validation, then it's automatically the indigenous elder knowledge keeper, they are validating, they are sharing their knowledge, and it becomes science. Their knowledge becomes science. And we are also changing the meaning of science to whatever extent we can. For my research, for example, I consider the indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories as a scientific stories. And I face problem during my community meeting. That one of the community members said, no, it's not scientific. Then my other committee member from indigenous scholar, the anti-racist scholar, they said, you don't have enough expertise, so you should leave. So that's why when you are doing PhD or doing research, try to connect with indigenous and land-based scholar who can support your work, that it is scientific work, and try to get advice from them how we can publish, how we can learn. So that's why we need to build our own community, the colonial community, in a way it can help us to grow.
Thank you very much for your answer. I see we have a new question. The question is, how can non-Indigenous researchers make sure they engage in this research in ethical ways? Should this work be left to Indigenous scholars?
First of all, if we want to work with indigenous people or land-based people, it's not we are working for others. It's working for ourselves to understand who we are and who we need to be. We need to take the decolonization courses. We need to take cross-cultural methodology courses. We need to take anti-racism courses. In a way, start the processing. Once we get the training, we can request respectfully and maintaining the protocol if we want to work with the indigenous community. If we can work, if we need to get more training, they can suggest. So I would like to request all of you, those who want to work with indigenous community or minority community, take the decolonization courses, anti-racism courses, first to understand who we are, first to understand how we need to unlearn that is not working. We need to understand the colonial forms of education that we got trained is not working. Not for the other people, even for me, it's not working. If it is not working for me, how is going to helpful for the other people? That's why anti-racism courses, decolonization courses, and respectful ways of requesting indigenous communities can be beneficial.
Thank you for your detailed answer. We have one more question in the chat, and I invite the audience to submit their questions or raise their hand if they want to ask online virtually. There will be 1 or 2 more questions before we conclude this webinar. And for now, the question is, you talk about relational theoretical framework where you considered participants as relatives. How can you keep yourself objective and not subjective during the research process? How do you overcome the situation when your emotions and feelings might impact on the research process?
Thank you. This is a great question. I wrote an article on this. I hope you will get the information. I do not consider myself objectives. I consider myself as very biased for the community, biased for the community needs, and I am proud for it. I am saying it loudly because if we are not supporting our emotion, if we are not supporting community needs, what actually we are doing? If we are remain objective, we are supporting indirectly existing colonial system. That's why, for particularly myself, I consider myself as a situated as a politically purposeful to helping the community, to helping my emotion that I want to be. And if you read my article, you can find that emotion. And I also request you to work for the community, work for the community needs, community emotion, be angry, be emotional the way you want to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Here's another question. So first of all, the audience, thank you for your inspiring presentation, Ranjan. And this question comes from a legal scholar who has read your journal papers about Indigenous people and often comes across ideas which suggest that Indigenous peoples live in harmony with nature. So this person wonders if such rhetoric, which is probably true, does not reinforce the racism against these people. In your research, did you encounter communities willing to embrace Western scientific knowledge? And if so, for what purpose?
Thank you. Many Western researchers, they think that when they are talking about indigenous perspective, indigenous ways of knowing, is very remote. It's very traditional. But if you look at the indigenous people here, they are scientists, engineer, they are doctor, they are very successful researcher. So we need to change the way we understand the meanings of indigenous. The indigenous or land-based people is very contemporary. That's why the indigenous people living in their land for thousands years. And they want to use Western science, as I said previously, to solve their problem, what is going on. They don't want to see myself as a sociologist, engineer, or doctor is separate. They want to see the problem and want to use Western science to solve that problem. And it's not that they don't want to use the technology or current tools. They want to use it meaningful way. They are not destroying the environment. They are not destroying their water. The water pipeline leaks happen, but the current profit maximize process is destroying for the human needs. We are destroying all non-human, insect, animal, water, everything. So we need to deconstruct the way we understand meanings of development, the meanings of the scientific ways of solving the problem. The community wants to see us into practice, into action, in a way they can use us, not we use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranjan, and thank you to the participants who asked these questions. There is one question in the chat, which can be a quick question because unfortunately we're going to have to conclude. The question is there any research on how to increase our understanding of our subjectivity? Any recommendations that you would like to share?
I already shared some of my current writing and previous writing, how to be impactful researcher when we are doing research. Hope you will get those reading from Art Governance. And if you can read it, and in future, if you have any question, please email me. I would love to share, because research is for decolonial research. It's not our responsibility also to share what we are doing and learn from each other.
The question is, can we share your presentation, Ranjan? Is your presentation going to be shareable?
I will, because as you seen, many presentation slide was not visible. I have to resend it. So I will send it to you and then can share definitely.
Wonderful. Then we will share this with the participants. You will receive an email with the link to this presentation. We will make sure that we publish it on the website. Thank you so much. It almost feels a bit short. Unfortunately, we have to conclude. But I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the Earth System Governance Project. From your presentation, I believe that we learned a profound insight today that decolonization is not just an isolated event, but an ongoing journey of continuous learning and unlearning. By trying to deeply understand impacts, meanings, and challenges inherent in this process, we lay the foundation for a truly decolonized perspective in both knowledge and doing. So you also shared compelling empirical examples from your PBS research. You showed that the existing governance structures are actually perpetuating power imbalances and uphold colonial practices. But you also showed an alternative path forward, and one that is actually embracing meaningful environmental governance by fostering collective and the most important community-driven approaches. So thank you so much for your presentation, Ranjan. Thank you everyone for attending this event. Feel free to reach out to us, to the Earth System Governance Project, to Ranjan personally, as he just invited you. And please be assured that we will share more information about this webinar by email. Thank you, everyone.